911, what is the address of your emergency?
It's an apartment complex, and I don't know what's going on, but he's banging all over, talking about can open the door. It's just really, it's disturbing loud, and it does not sound like something.
Okay, does he sound like he's inside, or maybe he's outside of the front door?
No, he sounds like he's inside because I can hear him.
Okay, what was it that he's saying?
Open the door. He's just cussing up a storm, but he's loud and he's banging on all the walls.
Okay.
So we have a 911 call here from obviously a neighbor in the apartment complex who's calling because the neighbor is extremely loud, cussing, saying to open the effing door. It sounds like the neighbor is inside his apartment, and so there's possibly a domestic dispute or some sort of argument going on within the apartment. It was loud enough that the neighbor decided to call 911, and so police then respond. So we're going to have two officers that respond to the apartment. One of them knocks on the door, and then they're both positioned on either side of the door. When the police arrive at the apartment, they don't hear any arguing, yelling, cussing. The other thing is the police officer knocks, but he doesn't actually announce himself. In my experience, this is somewhat unusual. You'd think that they would announce themselves after they knock on the door. We don't know what kind of neighborhood this is. I mean, the guy could be thinking that someone else is coming over. After he knocks, he steps kind of back behind a wall, and so neither one of them would be visible from the peephole in the door. Now the officer's trying to listen to see if he hears anybody inside the apartment, so clearly there's no more arguing or yelling going on at this point. And just to be clear, at this point, as far as we can tell, they're likely responding to either a disturbing the peace call or possibly, like I said, a domestic argument. The caller didn't state that they heard anybody else yelling and screaming or that they heard any sort of physical altercation. It sounds like they just heard him yelling.
Hey, dude, what's that?
The gentleman opens the door. The officer who knocked on the door doesn't have a vantage point to see the guy in the doorway. The other officer has a clear view and can see that the occupant has a gun in his right hand. The other officer is looking at the second one for cues as far as like what's going on, so they're not really communicating very well at this point. The apartment occupant is standing in the doorway to the point where now you can't see his right arm, and so at this point the officer obviously has seen a gun and now can't see the gun, and so in his position the standard would be at this point what is objectively reasonable as far as whether he's going to use force or not. Does he feel like he's in imminent danger or his partner's in imminent danger?
Hey, dude, come out. Shots fired, officer needs help. Shots fired, officer needs help.
So that all happened really quickly. Obviously, we have to look at being in the officer's position. Everything's happening very fast. He sees somebody with a gun. The apartment occupant wasn't pointing the gun at them. He was holding it down to his side, which I think it's reasonable to believe or conclude that he didn't know who was at the door when they knocked. But then he does step behind the doorway. And so at this point, this officer in his mind is probably thinking, well, I'm not going to wait to see if he fires his weapon or points it at us. However, I feel like the officer in this situation got a little trigger happy and was pretty quick to fire his weapon without giving this person the opportunity to drop his weapon, show his hands, and exit the apartment. The person that answered the door didn't look to be like he was acting aggressive or violent. He looked like he was curious to see who was at the door, and he did have the gun down by his side. You can see the police officer's position as far as not wanting to wait to see what happens. At the same time, I think he could have taken steps to de-escalate the situation without actually firing his weapon.
What you got, buddy? I got 2 lines up. Hey, come out with your hands up, man.
All right, bro. Let's see your head.
Come out. Come out with your hands up.
I got 2 lines.
Hey, dude, turn around. Turn around. Come down to your
Go
knees.
down on your knees. Down on your knees. Down. Put your hands on your head. Hands on your head. Lay down flat. Flat on the ground. Flat on the ground. You got it?
Yeah.
I'm going to listen.
All right. Are you hit?
No. I'm scared, bro.
Put your other hand behind your back.
Is there anybody else in the house? No. No one detained.
Hi, how you doing? Hey, dude, put that back, dude. Hey, dude. Is that a gun, Bobby? You want it up. I got 200 up. What you got, Bobby? I got 200 up.
After he fires his weapon, the suspect, in this case, shows his hands, exits the apartment, and lays down peacefully, and they're able to handcuff him. Arguably, he's probably scared shitless because he just got shot at. Luckily, he wasn't hit, and he's complying. But the officers never really gave him a chance in the first place to be compliant, to drop the weapon and show his hands. So he could have done that possibly without being shot at initially. So at the end of the day, I think it could go either way. I do think the officer was pretty quick to fire his weapon. There's really no indication when they show up that anyone's in immediate danger, that there's someone else in the apartment that may be in danger. It's more or less someone that's just being really loud inside their apartment. There's two other points to consider here. And you can see in the comments that after the fact, we find out that when the gentleman opened the door, at that point he realized they were officers. There's no indication that he knew that before opening the door. And once again, if they had just knocked and announced, this whole situation could have probably been avoided. At that point, when he opens the door and he's holding the weapon, the officer is then observing potentially a felony for assault with a deadly weapon if he feels like he's in imminent danger of being shot at. However, the apartment occupant never actually raises the weapon, never says anything in a threatening manner. So in this case, it's arguable that he didn't commit an assault with a deadly weapon, and also that didn't commit a brandishing because he's not holding the weapon in a threatening manner. He's not saying anything threatening or being aggressive. I think in this case, he'd have a tough time finding a lawyer to take a case to sue the police department because he did have a gun in his possession. Although he wasn't pointing at the officer was clearly in fear. I think it would be hard to prove a case like that in civil court if he wanted to sue the police for shooting at him. I think the police would have an argument that they were justified. If they had just knocked and announced and said, hey, it's police, we're here to talk to you, it might have been all avoided. He might have just left the gun somewhere else.